Chapter 2. Another day. Daniel. Daniel woke before the sun was fully up and sighed in relief when he realized that he had gotten through the entire night without the disturbance. He groaned slightly when he sat up, and the soreness hit him from the events of the past day. Daniel pulled his shoes on, grabbed his backpack, and tiptoed out of the house. He started walking towards the school, knowing it was much too early, but not wanting to risk lingering within the house. No need to tempt fate. He stopped when he reached the playground and sat on one of the swings. The morning air was slightly chilly, making bumps rise on his arm. He pulled his crumpled hoodie from his backpack and reached for his notebook and pencil. Shrugging into the jacket, he placed the tip of the pencil to the paper and looked around him. He spotted a tree and pursed his lips, staring at it. His hand began to move, and all of his attention was focused on the piece of paper before him. His mind quieted as his art absorbed all his senses, bringing him a feeling of momentary peace. Luther. Luther woke to his alarm. Stretching, he lay there in the silence for a while before standing and walking to the bathroom. He splashed cold water over his face and hair, toweling dry. Combing product through his hair, he opened his watch drawer, choosing a style and locking it around his wrist. He checked the time. He was going to be late. He walked down the stairs, grabbing an apple from the basket on the marble countertop. Mr. Luther, that is not a proper breakfast, Mabel chastened, looking flustered. Not hungry, and I'm going to be late, Luther said, rolling his eyes as he grabbed his bag and headed out the door. He slid into his glossy Mustang, his father's newest way to distract him from both his and his mother's absences. He'd grown used to this. He had no memories of life being any other way. He'd grown used to the silence, and he had done just fine on his own. Any hope for a different life had died long ago when he was a child, and Luther Hackle was no child now. He rolled down the windows as he drove, breathing in the morning air. As he pulled into the school parking lot, he spotted Daniel sitting on a swing at the playground. He glanced at the clock on the dash, eyebrows furrowing. School didn't start for another hour. He was only here so early because he had to serve detention for getting caught putting a kid in cafeteria in a trash can. Was Talon always here this early? Why? He considered this as he parked and walked towards the school's side entrance. He had to get to detention now, but he was determined to find out later. Daniel sighed in relief. He had seen Hackle walking, but he'd gone inside the school. Shaking his head, Daniel stood to pack away his things. He glanced at the sketch he'd made of the twisted tree with the jump rope hanging from it. He felt it was a powerful image, a tree strong, old, and unmoving, twisted up and bent towards the ground, but standing all the same, regardless of the weight of many years, many trials. The jump rope forgotten, swinging in the wind, clinging to the tree, holding tight to only thing within its reach, the only thing keeping it from fading away into the wind. Yeah. Daniel shoved the notebook in his bag and made his way towards the school. He decided to hide in the library until the cafeteria opened. No one was ever in there this early, and it was always unlocked. As he glanced around the nearly empty parking lot, he wondered what Hackle was doing here so early. Detention, more than likely. Daniel wasn't the only one he bullied, though he did seem to target Daniel more than anyone else. This didn't bother him so much, though. At least he knew that if anything ever happened to him, one person would notice he was gone, even if it was only because he was missing his favorite punching bag. Daniel pushed open the doors to the library and grabbed one of the art books he had been looking through. He sank down into an armchair and admired the artist's work. He hoped that he would be able to show the world his work one day. as long as he could make it to 18 and he'd catch a bus or a train and start a new life. A life away from all the pain. He'd find work somewhere and sleep on a park bench if he had to. He'd find a way to put his work out there, and one day, maybe, someone would pick up a book and see one of his drawings. Daniel was broken from his thoughts as the sounds of clanking lockers and chatting students filled his ears. He felt his stomach give an almighty roar, and he hurried towards the cafeteria. Food was the only thing on his mind. Once he had his tray and he was sitting down at his normal table by himself, he dug in. The gratefulness filled him as his stomach's ache began to lessen, and he sat back contently as his head became more clear. Luther. He always shovels his food like that, and he doesn't know when his next meal will be. Gavin sneered and looked over towards Daniel. Luther sneered as well, looking towards the thin boy. It's because he's less evolved than we are. His animal instincts must take over. His four friends laughed boisterously at his words, and Luther glanced over towards the boy again. He had a hand placed on his stomach, and he looked. What was that? Pleased? Shit, Terence muttered, elbowing Luther and pointing. The principal was walking towards Daniel, looking sullen. They saw emotion to Daniel's black eye and saw color rise in Daniel's face as he looked down at his knees. The principal motioned for him to follow, and Daniel's body seemed to sag as he stood and followed behind him. Luther's and Daniel's eyes connected for a fraction of a second, and Luther clearly saw fear in those eyes. If he rats us, I'll kill him, Jeff growled, watching the back of the skinny boy. I don't think he will, Luther said, still staring after them. Luther's right. He's too scared to tell. Did you see his face? Corey laughed, leaning back in his chair. It was true. Daniel looked terrified, but he had looked into Luther's eyes without blinking. Was it really them he was afraid of? What else would he be afraid of? Luther pushed the thoughts from his mind and attempted to join in on his friend's new conversation. Daniel, I'm going to effing die. Daniel thought, biting down on his already busted lip. The principal motioned for him to sit, and he slunk down into the chair, gripping his hands so they wouldn't shake. So you claim that you were throwing a ball and accidentally hit yourself in the face, the principal said. His look was incredulous. Yes, Daniel said, staring straight ahead with a well-practiced blank expression. Remove your jacket, please, Mr. Talon. Daniel stared at him. Sir? The principal motioned toward his hoodie. Your jacket, Mr. Talon. Daniel shrugged out of his hoodie, grateful for his long sleeves. Roll up your sleeves, please, Mr. Talon. Daniel's throat went dry. Shit, he knows. Daniel slowly rolled the sleeves up, revealing the many knuckle-shaped bruises. I started a fight. It was my fault, he stammered quickly, fear clutching at his chest. You claim this happened at school? Daniel nodded quickly, unable to speak. Are you not currently in foster care, Mr. Talon? Please, 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 no. I've always been in foster care, sir. The principal nodded. I'll have to report this, Mr. Talon. Daniel felt the color fade from his eyes. Please, sir, no. Everything's fine. I started a fight, that's all. Please, they'll move me to a new foster house. The principal frowned, a look of pity on his face. Maybe the next one will be better, Mr. Talon. When Daniel left the office, he hurried to the boys' restroom. It was empty. He clutched at the sink in front of him, trying to regulate his breathing. He attempted to splash water on his hot face, but his hands were shaking so badly that the water seemed to be going all over him instead of just on his face. The door opened, and Luther and his gang entered, each pair of eyes blazing. Daniel really didn't think he could handle this right now. Once the principal reported the bruises, the foster family would be contacted, and the man that was going to kill him, he couldn't think about it, and Luther and his stupid gang too. You better not have squealed, Talon, Luther hissed, advancing slowly. Daniel was still shaking, and his face grew even hotter with embarrassment as one of the boys began to laugh at him. No, I didn't. I I never have before, have I? So why the hell would I start now? Daniel was pleased that his voice came out stronger than he'd expected, and he looked up to meet Luther's piercing gaze. Good, he murmured, walking forward and backing Daniel up towards the hall. I hate to have to become vengeful. He slapped Daniel's cheek patronizingly, and Daniel glared at him with the utmost loathing. Come on, boys, Luther called, and they followed him out of the restroom. Daniel took several deep breaths and then walked dazedly to class, feeling like a dead man walking. Luther. Luther sat in his usual seat towards the middle of the classroom, surrounded by his friends. He glanced toward the back at Daniel. The boy was still shaking, staring at his desk as though it were a bottomless pit. When class started, Luther spun his pencil on his desk, not bothering to pretend to listen. Had he really scarred the boy that badly? Daniel had never seemed this scared of him before. He had to be missing something. There had to be something else going on. He continued to stew on Daniel and his odd behavior until class was over. He saw Daniel fly past out the door before anyone else even had time to stand. Curiosity was giving him a strong urge to follow the boy, but his friends were standing around him, so he decided against it. The next few classes flew by. Luther and his gang tripped a few students here and there and cornered the boy that told the teachers Luther had put him in a trash can, promising revenge. The boy wet himself and was sent home, much to Luther's displeasure. He was feeling particularly foul today and really wanted to pummel someone. Once they reached the lunchroom, Luther noticed that Daniel had hardly touched his food. He was always scarfing like there was no tomorrow. This definitely wasn't normal. So, what do you think? Gavin said a little louder as he prodded his friend. What? Luther replied, eyebrows pulling together. Gavin rolled his eyes. I said, what do you think about cornering Talon again after school? He seems to be off his guard today. Could be fun. Luther pursed his lips. He didn't want to hit Talon right now. Not when he looked so down and defenseless. Where was the fun in it if Talon wasn't going to fight back? Luther turned his gaze away from the small boy and focused on his friends. Actually, I was thinking of going after Reed. You know, the best friend of that little pisser that snitched on me. His friends grinned wide and they began to strategize attacks. Luther wasn't really listening, though. He didn't know why Talon's mood was affecting him so much, but Talon, in a down and depressed mood, took all the fun out of Luther's taunting and bullying. He watched as the boy stood and started walking his nearly full tray to the trash cans. A thought crossed Luther's mind, and without a second pause, his foot shot out, tripping Daniel and watching the boy's face splat into uneaten food. The cafeteria rolled with laughter, and Luther smirked in victory, and this was sure to get a rise out of Talon. No way he could get back from this. Daniel stumbled to his feet, wiping food from his eyes and face. He straightened up, glaring daggers at Luther for a full minute, saying nothing, and then he stooped to pick his tray and continued making his way towards the trash can. Luther felt immensely disappointed that his plan hadn't worked and irritated with himself that it even seemed to matter. What's wrong, Talon? Afraid to take another beating? He had no idea why, but Daniel turned rather suddenly, staring at him with wide, frightened eyes, his mouth slightly open. He trembled for a moment, and then comprehension seemed to fill his expression, and his face fell into the most hopeless, haunted look Luther had ever seen on a person. It was almost resigned. Daniel threw his tray into the trash and hurried out of the cafeteria, ignoring all of these stares. That was weird, Jeff muttered, staring at the place where Daniel had just vanished. Luther nodded, but made no comment and swiftly changed the subject. What was this he was feeling? It almost felt like guilt. Daniel. The moment school ended, Daniel ran from the building. His body hurt and his nerves were stretched to the point of breaking. If Luther and his gang cornered him now, he would have no control. He couldn't not cry out if they hit him. He couldn't put up with the walls and remain unaffected by the things they said. His head was out of room. He was terrified for his life. He knew there was a strong possibility that he would take a final breath tonight. Worst of all, there wasn't a darn thing he could do about it. Once he stood, panting, in front of the Foster's house, in front of the door, he froze. He knew he had to do this, to bear whatever happened, but his legs felt like mush. They refused to move. He pushed the door open and felt all of the oxygen leave his lungs. The large woman grabbed him and shoved him against the wall. "What did you do?" she snarled, pressing harder against Daniel's chest. I... She dropped him, and he lay gasping on the floor for a moment before the fuzzy spots left his eyes. "George has been out of town, but he should be back either late tonight or early morning. I'll let him deal with you then." She walked past him, and her words echoed inside his brain. He shuffled to his room and sat on his ripped-up mattress, tossing back and forth, trying to soothe himself. If they killed him, it would be because Question's in trouble, right? So surely they wouldn't. But the threat had been crystal clear in the woman's voice. He was going to be hurt, badly hurt. But he'd survive, right? He had to survive. He had to make it to 18. Then he'd leave this place and never look back. He kept his mind firmly on 18, and that was the only thing that seemed to get him through most nights. He sat there rocking for a long time, but exhaustion was quickly taking him over. After the first period, his stomach had been so sick that he'd run from the room and thrown up his breakfast. His stomach had remained sick, so he had hardly touched his lunch. Dinner wasn't something that existed for him, so he was solely reliant on the school's food. Panic and lack of calories had made his brain go fuzzy, and to his horror he fell asleep. Luther lay on his bed, staring up at the ceiling moodily. Talon hadn't fought him at all, and he had completely ignored all his taunts and jeers. He hadn't even responded when Luther tripped him in the cafeteria. What was wrong with the boy? And why did he even give a shit? It shouldn't matter, but it did. Luther rolled over, trying to find a more comfortable position. There had to be a way to find out what was going on. He would find out. He'd make sure of it. Luther hated change. He had become quite comfortable with his daily routine of running with his gang, beating on Talon, playing his guitar, and then doing it all over again. But today, when he got home from school, not a single chord had come to mind. After sitting in the music room for after hours, he'd been given up and he'd gone to lie down. This was Talon's fault for throwing off his normal daily chain of events. Well, that ended tomorrow. He'd find out exactly what was going on. The sooner he did, the sooner things could go back to normal.